So Heartland asked me to talk about the 2009 endangerment finding in the context of the DOE critical review that Judith just summarized. I will lay my cards on the table immediately. The 2009 endangerment finding is not the most dishonest exercise in political analysis that I've ever seen in the Beltway, and I'm older than most of you, trust me. But it's down there, or up there, however you want to, let's see, how do I advance this? There we go. So what I want to talk about today is, what did the EPA assert in 2009 in support of their finding that greenhouse gas emissions reasonably can be anticipated to endanger human health and welfare, the public health and welfare. And then what does the evidence, both before and after 2009, tell us? And I'm going to talk in summary fashion about the general evidence and also the evidence presented in the critical review, almost all of which is quite consistent. I want to talk about the de minimis problem. What can we say about the impacts of US greenhouse gas emissions in the context of the endangerment finding? It turns out that if you think about it the right way, which is to say, if you think about it the way that I do, then the argument that even total US greenhouse gas emissions, let alone emissions from vehicles or emissions from Section 202A vehicles, and I'll explain what that means in a few minutes, endanger public health and welfare is preposterous. I want to talk about the greenhouse gas emission scenarios that the EPA applied in 2009, because they're interesting in their own way, and then offer a few conclusions. So what did they assert in 2009? They said that because of increasing atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, there would be an increase in smog, ambient ground ozone. There would be an increase in the numbers and intensities of hurricanes, and they claimed, the EPA in 2009, that there was some evidence of increasing intensities of Atlantic hurricanes. I'll get back to that in a minute. There would be an increase in flooding. There would be an increased likelihood of heat waves. The heat wave argument in particular, I think, is very, very strange in the context of standard textbook atmospheric physics. I'll get to that in a few minutes. There would be an adverse net impact on mortality from heat and cold. This is, again, what EPA argued in 2009. There would be more wildfires, more droughts. There would be adverse effects on both US and global food production. There would be adverse effects on US water quality. There would be an acceleration in sea level rise. That's basically what they argued. So what did the data tell us? That, well, EPA reports beginning in 1980, in other words, long before 2009 and thereafter, there's been almost a monotonic decline in smog and ground ozone over the entire period, 1980 to 2025. EPA obviously knew this in 2009 and simply ignored it. With respect to hurricanes, Ryan Maui in 2011, I guess, published a paper summarizing the satellite evidence on hurricane numbers and intensities from the satellite record that began in 1973, and then he updates that every month. And the same data are cited in the DOE critical review, and as a crude generalization, there's no trend beginning in 1973 in the numbers of global cyclones and in the intensities of global cyclones, a metric called accumulated cyclone energy, which is basically a wind speed index measuring the destructiveness of any given hurricane or any given hurricane season. The same data are cited in the Energy Department Critical Review. NOAA, in its data set, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, publishes the Atlantic hurricane intensity trend beginning in 1967. And that intensity trend is basically driven by three outliers: 2005, 2010, and 2020. And so, as Judith mentioned during her presentation, the critical review notes a substantial undercounting problem before 1965. So the EPA assertion in 2009 that there is some evidence of increasing intensities of the Atlantic hurricane record is based upon 1 year, 2005, which tells you everything you need to know about the quality of the statistical analysis that EPA applied in terms of arriving at its conclusions in the 2009 endangerment finding. IPIC, in the most recent assessment report, in terms of flooding, said, quote, they have low confidence for observed changes in the magnitude or frequency of floods at the global scale. The critical review offers the same citation. Hirsch and Ryberg, in a paper, I guess in 2011, in Geophysical Research Letters, I think that was the journal, found no statistical correlation between atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations and U.S. flooding. The critical review argues that there is no, quote, robust evidence that these trends are attributable to human influences. EPA in its data shows no trend in the heat wave index beginning in 1895, except for the 1930s, as Judith noted, and the U.S. Climate Reference Network, which is a system of meticulously maintained temperature stations across the U.S. and in Hawaii and Alaska, shows no temperature trend for the 20-year period, 2005 to 2025. I'd be a little careful about drawing conclusions from that. 20 years is not very much, and we need to wait. But nonetheless, those data I think are interesting. I wouldn't draw too many conclusions from it, but they're interesting nonetheless. The critical review in figure 6.3.3 in the period beginning in 1898, there's no trend in record highs and fewer record lows. Now, I mentioned that the heat wave argument from the alarmist community is very strange because my understanding of standard textbook atmospheric physics, and I'm but a lowly economist, so maybe I'm getting this wrong, is that the effects of increasing atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases are predicted, again, in standard textbook atmospheric physics to be observed for the most part in the northern hemisphere, in the coldest, driest air masses, in other words, Eastern Asia and Western North America, in the winter. And so you shouldn't really be seeing increases in average high temperatures. What you should be seeing are increases in average low temperatures, and those are two very different phenomena. That's what the critical review reports, and Steve Koonin, one of the authors in his really excellent book, Unsettled, I recommend it highly, points out that since 1900, average high temperatures have barely changed at all. It's average low temperatures that have increased. And so what the alarmists have resorted to is a statistical trick. They claim that the ratio of average highs to average lows has increased, which is true, but that's only because average lows have increased. Average highs have not increased at all. And so that is a statistic that is fundamentally misleading. With respect to the effect on net mortality, the Lancet has published 3 major international studies reporting cold-related deaths at least an order of magnitude higher than heat-related deaths. The critical review offers those same citations plus others in its figure 10.2. You know, Bjorn Lomborg, who's a very, very smart guy, he drives me nuts every time, because everything he writes, he starts out by saying that global warming is an important problem and we need to do something. And then he proceeds to show why it's not an important problem and why anything we do wouldn't matter anyway. And so, I mean, I've told this to Bjorn any number of times, and he just won't listen to me. He's a lot like my wife. He points out that for the U.S., annual heat and cold-related deaths are respectively about 9,000 and 144,000. The critical review reports sharp declines in U.S. heat-related mortality for various periods and with various citations. With respect to wildfires, the National Interagency Fire Center reports about a 75% decline in the number of U.S. wildfires since 1926 and no trend since 1985. They stopped publishing the data before 1985 on the purported grounds that the data are different. There's been a change in definitions, which is sort of true, but I think not really relevant. I think they should not have stopped publishing those data. You can still find them, and I have them. They also reported about an 85% decline in U.S. acreage, a slight increase since 1985, and that is obviously due to government forest mismanagement. You know, I was on one of the NPR radio stations, I don't know, 5 years ago or so, debating climate issues with some robot from the Sierra Club, and this young lady was absolutely adamant that the wildfire problem was the result of climate change, increasing atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. And so this was on the air. I asked her to explain to the audience why increasing atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases should be predicted to have adverse wildfire effects vastly greater in government forests than private forests. And when I asked that question, there was a silence on the radio for what seemed to go on for an hour, obviously didn't. It was a few seconds, at which point the moderator, the NPR moderator, jumped in and tried to save her. And being the chivalrous sort that I am, I said, no, let's give Ms. Smith, or whatever her name was, all the time she needs to answer that question. And they cut to a commercial, and I never, anyway. It's always fun debating those people. With respect to global wildfires, NASA reports a 25% decline in global wildfire acreage for the period beginning in 1998 and ending in 2015. The critical review in its figure 6.8.1 shows no global trends since 2001. Are we really going to enforce the time limit? I don't have to shut up. So the EPA, with respect to drought, the EPA reports no trend in the U.S. Palmer Drought Severity Index since 1985. And the critical review reports a very similar data set. It's not the Palmer Drought Severity Index, it's a different data set, but it shows the same trend since 1895 in its figures 6.7.1. Vicente and Serrano and a bunch of other co-authors show in a paper in the Transactions of the Royal Society an approximate decline in the surface area of global drought since 1950 of about 0.5% per decade. The critical review reviews what the IPIC says in the 6th assessment report. A few AR6 regions show observed increases in meteorological drought. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization reports an increase of global food production per capita, per person, of about 39% since 1980, the US about 15%. There's no direct discussion of food production in the critical review that I saw. If I'm wrong, Ross, I need to hear that, but I didn't find anything in the critical review on food production. The GAO, with respect to US water quality, basically says there's general improvement, but threats remain. And what those threats are supposed to be, no one knows. With respect to sea level rise, there's really no clear answer in my reading of the literature. The alarmists try to take the earlier tidal gauge data and tack on the satellite altimeter data and claim there's been an acceleration because the tidal gauge data show an annual increase, an annual rise in sea levels of about 1.9 millimeters per year. The satellite data show about 3.3 millimeters per year. And so they claim there's been an acceleration. Well, the two data sets are not comparable, and so they really can't mash them together. The critical review points out, I think appropriately, that the largest US increases are driven by land subsidence, not increasing atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. Is the further matter that the extreme projections for sea levels are driven by implausible extreme emission scenarios, representative concentration path 8.5, which I'll get to in a minute. Voortman and DeVos in a recent paper show that there's no statistically significant acceleration globally in sea level rise. I'd be a little careful. Too many of our allies have jumped on that paper and endorsed it. The authors are quite careful to point out that the data are lousy. And so I'd be a little careful about endorsing that paper or its findings. And the larger problem is that sea levels are driven by both natural and anthropogenic or man-made causes. What's the mix? Nobody knows. The implicit or explicit assumption on the part of the alarmists is that everything that happens is caused by man. That's just silly. There are lots of things that happen naturally. So the data largely refute the assertions made by the EPA in 2009, both in the years leading to 2009 and subsequently. And so I think the Trump administration is quite right to rescind the 2009 endangerment finding because it is, just in terms of its data analysis, it is arbitrary and capricious and should be rescinded. There's also the de minimis issue. How much, the argument that US greenhouse gas emissions can be seen to threaten public health and welfare is just silly. If you use the EPA climate model, the model for the assessment of greenhouse gas impacts of climate change, version 7, which I run all the time, eliminating all US greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 would reduce global temperatures in the year 2100 by something on the order of 14/100ths of a degree. And that's under really quite assumptions that exaggerate the effects of greenhouse gas emissions. If you use an assumption much more consistent with the peer-reviewed literature, you wind up with about 1/10 of a degree. That would be not measurable because that's about the same as the normal variability or the standard deviation of the service temperature record. If you eliminate the endangerment finding refers to new vehicles, which means not pre-owned, basically, is what that means. You get 24/1000ths of a degree. And so even though EPA in 2009 admitted explicitly that trivial effects might not be subject to regulation, they went ahead and did it anyway. even though their own model says that the effects are not measurable. For that reason, the argument that US greenhouse gas emissions may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health is just preposterous. And that's why EPA lied. I mean, that's the way to put it, about conflating global US vehicle and Clean Air Act Section 202A vehicle emissions. They lied when they said in their Table 1 that Section 202A greenhouse gas emissions were about 23.5% of all. That figure applies to all US vehicles, not Section 202A vehicles. So again, on that basis alone, the endangerment findings should be deemed arbitrary and capricious and rescinded. I guess I'm running out of time here, and I want to leave enough for Q&A. The emission scenarios that EPA used in 2009 as a crude generalization were even more preposterous than representative concentration 8.5, which IPIC itself admits is unrealistic. It's worse than merely unrealistic. It is literally impossible. So anyway, the endangerment findings driven by models that overstate the tropospheric temperature record by a factor of over 2.5, emission scenarios that are essentially impossible. The endangerment finding is not supported by the evidence on climate phenomena. US emissions are too small to reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health and welfare. In general, the analysis underlying the endangerment finding is very poor. It should be rescinded. Thank you very much.